The smell of solvent and linseed oil still clung to Elise Thornton's fingertips when she pushed open the door to her cramped Brooklyn walk-up. But the first thing she noticed wasn't the exhaustion from 12 hours of restoring old paintings. It was the black leather envelope sitting in the middle of her kitchen table, far too elegant for an apartment where she had to think twice about every electricity bill. Inside was a handwritten invitation in gold ink, requesting her presence at an art auction hosted by Cade and Albright, addressed to her by name, Elise Thornton, as though someone had done their homework long before sending it. She hadn't even set it down when Troy walked out of the bedroom, his shirt collar wrinkled, and she caught a perfume that wasn't hers, something sweet and heavy clinging to the fabric like a confession he never intended to make. Troy snatched the invitation from her hand, his face shifting in a way she'd never seen in 3 years of marriage. Not anger, but fear. The kind of fear that belongs to a man who's just realized his biggest secret is about to surface. "Who do you know at Cade's?" he snapped. Elise shook her head, genuinely confused, because she had no idea who Paxton Cade was. But Troy knew exactly, because he owed that man's organization a debt large enough to destroy everything they'd built together. And before the argument could even ignite, Troy's phone buzzed against the countertop, the screen glowing just long enough for Elise to read a single message, cold as steel. "Deadline's passed. We're coming to see your wife." Elise looked at her husband. Her husband looked at the phone, and in that thick silence she understood that the life she'd known had just ended, even though she had no idea yet what was about to replace it. If you want to find out who the man behind that invitation really is, and why he chose Elise, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Troy said nothing more for the rest of the evening. He sat on the sofa, turned on the television, but his eyes were not looking at the screen, his finger tapping again and again against the side of his glass of water, as if he were counting down something inside his head. When Elise asked about the message on his phone, he gave a faint laugh, the kind of laugh she had seen hundreds of times whenever he wanted to close a conversation before it could go too far. "A coworker was joking," he said. "The guys on the trading floor tease each other like that, you know." Elise did not know. She had never known anything about Troy's work beyond what he chose to tell her, and what he chose to tell her was always just enough to keep her from asking more. But that night, she did not argue. She nodded, washed the dishes, wiped the kitchen counter where the black leather envelope had been lying, then said she was tired and went to bed first. Troy did not follow her into the bedroom right away. She heard him open the refrigerator, pour himself more water, then heard his slow footsteps going into the bathroom. When he finally lay down in bed, Elise was already lying still, eyes closed, her breathing even like someone deep asleep. She waited. 20 minutes, maybe 30, she was not sure, because every minute stretched like an hour. Troy's breathing grew heavier, steadier, then sank into the kind of silence that belongs only to someone who has truly let go. Elise opened her eyes. She lay still for another moment, staring at the darkness on the ceiling, then slowly sat up. Troy's phone lay on the nightstand, screen turned down the way it was every night. She picked it up, so gently that even she was surprised her hand did not tremble. The password was his birthday. Troy had never imagined she would need to open his phone, so he had never changed it. The message appeared right on the home screen, and it was not from a coworker, not a joke. The name Renata Voss sat at the top of the conversation list, with a small red heart Troy had placed beside her name. Elise opened the conversation. The first line she read was, "I miss you. Last night was amazing," followed by an emoji she did not need anyone to explain. The next line, Renata asked about the plan for next week, and Troy answered that he would arrange it so Elise doesn't suspect anything. Her name lay inside her husband's conversation with another woman, not with respect or concern, but as an obstacle that needed to be handled. Elise scrolled up and read more. Renata called Troy by a private name Elise had never heard, the kind of intimate name that exists only between two people who have shared more than a few dinners. There were lines mentioning restaurants, hotels, and once Renata wrote, "I'll wear the dress you like," and Troy answered with 3 short words that were enough for Elise to understand this relationship had not just begun. She placed the phone back exactly where it had been, screen down the way Troy had left it, then lay down again. She did not cry. She did not shake. She only lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, and felt something colder than pain spreading slowly through her chest. She thought of her mother, 5 years earlier, in a hospital bed, when her body had already grown too weak to sit up, but her voice was still clear enough for Elise to remember every word. Her mother had held her hand and said, "Never let anyone make you feel like you're unnecessary inside your own home." Elise had nodded, had promised, had believed she would keep that promise. But lying there, in the bedroom whose rent she paid every month with sleepless nights restoring paintings, beside the man who called her an obstacle in messages with another woman, Elise understood that she had betrayed her mother's words a long time ago. The next morning, after Troy left for work, Elise stood in front of the trash can in the kitchen. The auction card with gold ink lay at the bottom, slightly crumpled, but the writing was still clear. Troy had thrown it away the night before. Elise bent down, picked it up, smoothed it flat, then slipped it into her coat pocket. She did not know who Paxton Cade was. She did not know why he had sent the card to her, but she knew one thing. For the first time in 3 years, someone had written her name on an invitation, as if she were a person worth inviting, and she would not let that card die in the trash along with the rest of this marriage. The only black dress in Elise's closet was something she had bought 3 years earlier during an end-of-season sale at a small shop near the train station, made from the kind of synthetic fabric she had to hang in the bathroom and steam with hot water until the wrinkles loosened, because she did not own an iron good enough to do the job. She stood before the bedroom mirror, pulled the zipper up behind her back, then looked down at her hands. Beneath her fingernails, faint streaks of solvent still remained even though she had scrubbed them twice, the kind of professional trace that never fully disappeared. Just like the smell of linseed oil that had soaked into her skin so long ago it had become part of her body. She slipped the gold ink invitation into her old handbag, locked the apartment door, and took the train to Tribeca before she could change her mind. Cade and Albright Auction House stood on a quiet street a few blocks from the harbor, looking from the outside like an old red brick warehouse. But inside, it was another world entirely. The ceiling was higher than any room Elise had ever stepped into, and crystal chandeliers cast warm light down over walls hung with 17th-century oil paintings in gilded wooden frames. The polished stone floor shone so brightly she could see her own reflection below, a small, out-of-place figure standing among tailored suits and evening gowns that each probably cost more than 6 months of rent for her apartment. She tightened her grip on the strap of her handbag and moved slowly along the edge of the room, trying not to touch anyone, trying not to draw attention, moving with the instinct of someone used to making herself smaller in spaces that did not belong to her. She had just stopped before an 18th-century portrait of a woman, her professional instinct making her tilt her head to examine the craquelure across the surface, when a woman's voice sounded right beside her, low, clear, and so calm it was almost cold. "You look at that painting like someone who knows what it's trying to say." Elise turned. The woman standing there looked about 35, black hair pulled back neatly, wearing a dark gray fitted suit, her posture straight as a ruler, no jewelry, no perfume, not a single unnecessary detail on her body. "I'm Sable Munoz," she said, without offering her hand. "I work for Mr. Cade, and you are Elise Thornton." Not a question, a statement. Elise felt her stomach tighten. "You know me?" "Mr. Cade knows you," Sable replied, then tilted her head slightly toward the far side of the room. "He's standing there." Elise looked in the direction Sable had indicated. Across the auction room, among the collectors and businessmen speaking in bright, effortless clusters, a man stood alone, not because no one wanted to stand near him, but because the space around him naturally formed an emptiness that other people instinctively did not enter. A black 3-piece suit, dark hair a little long and combed back, a glass of whiskey in his hand, though the surface of the drink remained level as if it had never been touched. Paxton Cade was not watching the auction. He was not watching the paintings. He was watching her. His gaze met Elise's for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for her to feel as though she had been read from the outside in. Then he looked away, calm, unsmiling, offering no nod, no smile, no polite gesture to acknowledge her existence. But those 2 seconds were enough for Elise to understand one thing. This man did not look at her the way Troy looked at her. Not with possession, not with indifference. He looked at her the way someone assessed a painting before deciding whether it was worth saving. Sable led Elise along the auction room, giving brief explanations about the lots on display without truly seeming to care about Elise's answers. When the auction began, the rhythmic sound of the gavel and the calling of bids rose through the room, and Sable stood beside Elise and said, her voice still level, as if she were reading a weather report, "Mr. Cade would like to speak with you privately after the auction, about a matter involving your husband." Elise's heart struck once, hard, then seemed to stop for half a second before beating again. What matter? She asked, trying to keep her voice calm, though the end of the question still trembled slightly. Sable looked at her, her gaze not cold but not warm either, only the gaze of someone who had seen too much in life to still busy herself with other people's emotions. He'll explain, Sable said, then turned her face toward the auction stage, as if the conversation had ended. Elise stood there, between the sound of the gavel and the murmurs of wealthy strangers she did not know, her hand gripping the strap of her handbag until her knuckles turned white, and felt something pulling her toward the room upstairs where Paxton Cade was waiting, not by invitation, but by gravity. The kind of gravity she knew that once she stepped into it, there would be no turning back. Sable led Elise up to the second floor by the back staircase. The kind of narrow staircase auction guests would never know existed. Each of Elise's footsteps sounded against the old wooden steps like a countdown toward something she had not yet been able to name. Sable opened the heavy door at the end of the hallway, then stood aside, not following her in, only looking at Elise with an expression she could not read as warning or pity, before closing the door behind her. The room was smaller than she had imagined. A dark wooden table, a desk lamp casting warm yellow light across the wood, 2 leather chairs facing each other, no windows. On the wall behind the chair across from her, a large painting hung in a black wooden frame, the portrait of a woman whose gaze looked straight ahead, but the painting was badly damaged, a long slash running diagonally across the shoulder, the left corner burned black, the paint layer peeling in patches like skin being stripped away. Elise's professional instinct wanted to step closer, tilt her head, and assess the damage. But she did not have time, because Paxton Cade was already sitting in the chair behind the table, and she was not sure whether he had been there all along, or had somehow appeared while she was looking at the painting. The whiskey glass was no longer in his hand. His vest was still buttoned. He watched her sit down in the chair opposite him without inviting her, and began speaking without greeting her. Your husband owes me $400,000. The sentence fell into the middle of the room like a stone dropped into a deep well. Elise heard it, but it took her several seconds to understand. The same way it had when she read Renata's messages on Troy's phone the night before, her brain receiving the signal while her heart refused to process it. I don't understand, she said. Paxton pushed a brown leather folder across the table, unopened, leaving her to open it herself. Troy Whitmore borrowed this money through illegal betting with my organization over the past 2 years, he said, his voice even, as if he were reading a financial report. He used your social security number, your bank account, and a forged version of your signature as collateral. On every document, the person who owes me money is not Troy Whitmore. It's Elise Thornton. Elise opened the folder. Her hand trembled, but she still turned each page. Her signature, but not written by her, almost 90% accurate, close enough to fool anyone who was not her. The bank account number she used to receive restoration payments from clients. The social security number she only used when filing taxes. All of it lay neatly inside the pages that her husband had signed in her place, forged in her name, turning her into the debtor of an underworld organization whose name she had not known until tonight. Her eyes reddened, but no tears fell. She looked up at Paxton. I didn't know anything about this. Paxton nodded slowly. I know. Then why am I sitting here? She asked. Why not Troy? Because Troy ran, Paxton answered, and for the first time, there was something faintly like exhaustion in his voice. I've collected from him many times. He promised, then hid, then promised again. The card I sent you wasn't meant to threaten you. It was meant to force him to face things once his wife started asking questions he couldn't answer. Elise understood. She was a piece on the board, not the target, but a tool. She swallowed the bitterness down her throat and asked the next question, her voice calmer than she thought possible. Then why send it to me? Why not come to the house and find him yourself? Paxton looked at her for a long time before saying, Because I need you for another reason. He tilted his head slightly toward the damaged painting behind him. This painting needs to be restored. But it is not something I can bring to any official restorer, because its origin would be traced. I need someone outside the system, with no ties to the auction world, no name in any professional directory. He paused. 6 months ago, a small 19th century still life passed through my organization. That painting had been restored by someone I later checked and found to be a 27-year-old woman working freelance in Brooklyn, someone who took small jobs nobody else bothered with. But the skill in her hands was not small at all. Elise remembered that still life. A small commission from a private collector, a few $100s, 2 weeks of work, delivered and forgotten. She had never imagined that painting would lead her into this room. The arrangement is simple, Paxton said. You restore this painting for me. In exchange, I erase the entire $400,000 debt in your name, and I give you all the evidence of identity fraud committed by Troy. Whether you use it in court, in a divorce, or burn it in the fireplace, is your choice. Elise looked at the file, looked at the damaged painting, looked at the man sitting across from her with dark brown eyes that promised nothing beyond a clean transaction. How long do I have to decide? She asked. 48 hours, Paxton answered. Then he stood, buttoned his vest again, and added one final sentence before leaving the room, his voice neither rising nor falling, yet every word was heavy as lead. After 48 hours, I collect debts my way. Elise did not wait until morning. She left Cade and Albright auction house as soon as Paxton stepped out of the room, walking quickly down the hallway, down the narrow staircase, past Sable, who stood leaning against the wall without saying a word. She took the train back to Brooklyn, sitting in a nearly empty car, her arms wrapped tightly around the handbag holding the file Paxton had let her take with her. $400,000 in black ink on white paper sitting in her lap like a bomb that had not yet gone off. When she opened the door to the apartment, Troy was sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him, but she knew he was not working because the screen showed the homepage of an online betting site he had not managed to close in time. Troy snapped the laptop shut the moment he saw her, so fast it was almost reflex, and asked where she had been so late in the voice she had grown used to hearing for 3 years, the voice of control disguised as concern. Elise did not answer his question. She set the file on the kitchen table, opened it, turned to the page with her forged signature, and said, "Explain this." Troy looked at the file. His face did not change right away, but moved through a quick series of expressions like slow-motion film. Surprise, calculation, then false calm. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Answer my question," Elise said. $400,000. My name. A signature I never wrote. Explain it." Troy pushed his chair back, stood, and walked toward the window, running a hand nervously through his hair and leaning against the frame, as if he needed time to arrange his words. Then he turned back, and instead of explaining, he attacked. "You went to see Paxton Cade," Troy said, his voice dropping lower, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to control the conversation. "Do you know who he is? He's a criminal boss, Elise. And you went to see him alone, at night, in a black dress. What do you expect me to think?" Elise felt blood rush to her face, not from shame, but from anger, the kind of anger she had swallowed for so long she had forgotten what it tasted like. "You're changing the subject," she said. "I'm not changing anything." Troy stepped closer, his finger pointing at the file. "I'm asking why my wife was sitting in a private room with a criminal at 10 o'clock at night. Because that criminal showed me the forged signature you used to borrow money in my name," Elise answered, and for the first time in 3 years, she did not lower her voice at the end of the sentence. Troy went silent for 1 beat, then laughed, a short, dry, joyless laugh. "You're always like this," he said, "always ready to believe anyone who says something bad about me. Did you forget who paid your mother's hospital bills? Did you forget who carried this family while all you did was sit around smearing paint onto old pieces of canvas?" The sentence about her mother hurt more than everything else. Troy knew that. He always knew exactly where to place the blade. But Elise did not step back. "Then who is Renata Voss?" she asked. Silence. The kind of silence long and heavy as wet concrete. Troy did not answer, but his jaw tightened enough for Elise to see it. "I read your messages," she continued. "Last night, while you were asleep. I know who Renata is. I know how you betrayed our marriage, and I know what you called me in your messages with her." Troy exploded, not with shouting, but with a voice compressed so tightly it sounded like a hiss through his teeth. "You read my phone? You invaded my privacy? That's a boundary, Elise. That's something you don't get to cross." "And forging my signature to borrow $400,000 isn't a boundary?" she answered. Troy opened his mouth, but before he could speak, his phone vibrated on the table. He glanced down, meaning to silence it, but his finger hit the speaker button by mistake, and Renata Voss's voice filled the small kitchen, clear, sharp, undeniable. "Baby, don't let that little girl find out about the Cayman accounts. Delete all the messages. Call me back when she's asleep. Troy snatched up the phone and turned off the speaker, but the sound had already filled the room, and there was no way to take it back. Elise stood there, looking at her husband, and for the first time, she saw clearly what she had chosen to blur for 3 years. The look Troy gave her now was not the look of a husband caught in the act. Not guilt, not shame. It was calculation. The look of a man weighing how much damage could still be controlled, and what he needed to say next to put her back in her old place. "You don't understand anything," Troy said, his voice cold and flat as a stone countertop. "Go to your room." Elise looked at him, looked at the small kitchen she cleaned every day, looked at the laptop with the betting site he had not closed in time, looked at the file with the forged signature bearing her name. Then she said, not loudly, but with every word clear, "No." Elise said no, and Troy did not say another word. He looked at her with cold eyes, the kind of look she had once mistaken for calm, but now recognized as the calculation of a man deciding his next move. Then he took his phone and laptop, walked into the bedroom, and closed the door. Elise stood alone in the kitchen, her hand still resting on the file, listening to Troy speaking on the phone behind the closed door, his voice hushed and urgent, though she could not make out the words. She did not know that while she stood there looking at the solvent stains beneath her fingernails and wondering where her life had gone wrong, Troy was making the call that would take away the last things she had left. The next morning, Elise woke on the sofa, where she had slept all night because she did not want to go into the bedroom they shared. Troy was gone, with no note left behind, no coffee on the stove, no sign that he had ever been there except for the pillow sitting slightly crooked on the bed, which she could see through the half-open bedroom door. She picked up her phone, opened the banking app the way she did every morning, and everything stopped. Joint account. 0 balance. Not almost 0, not lower than usual, but a perfect, absolute 0, clean as if there had never been a single dollar inside it. She scrolled down through the transaction history. Multiple withdrawals had been made through the night, beginning at 2 o'clock in the morning, while she had been lying on the sofa staring at the ceiling in the dark. Troy had withdrawn one amount after another, transferred each batch, cleared out everything she had spent 4 years saving from sleepless nights, restoring paintings, from small commissions that paid a few $100s, from months when she ate instant noodles to save money for her mother's hospital bills. She tried to open her credit card. Access denied. The backup card. Maxed out. She called Troy. No answer. Called a second time. Straight to voicemail. The third time, the number said it could not be reached. He had blocked her. Elise sat on the sofa, phone in hand, staring at the 0 on the screen, and felt something heavier than pain pressing down on her chest. Not anger, not fear, but the feeling of being erased, crossed out of her own life by the person she had once trusted most. The doorbell rang close to noon. 2 men stood in the hallway, one tall and thin in a brown coat, the other shorter with glasses, both of them wearing expressions that were not threatening, but not compassionate either. The man with glasses said, "Miss Thornton?" Elise nodded. He handed her a stack of papers and explained in a steady voice, the voice of someone who had said this sentence hundreds of times before, that this apartment had been used as collateral for a loan signed in her name, that the payment was overdue, and that according to the terms of the contract, the lender had the right to repossess the property. Elise looked at the papers, the familiar forged signature, the same stroke pattern she had seen in the file Paxton had given her the night before. Troy had mortgaged the apartment in her name to another loan shark group, not Paxton, to pay interest on the Cade debt. He had stacked debt on top of debt, all in her name, all behind her back, and now everything was collapsing onto her at once. "You have 24 hours to collect your personal belongings," the tall, thin man said, not impolite, but leaving no room for pleading. She did not plead. She signed to confirm she had received the notice, closed the door, and began packing her clothes into the only suitcase she owned. She took nothing that belonged to Troy. No wedding photographs, no anniversary gifts, nothing that reminded her she had once belonged to someone. She took only her clothes, a few small restoration tools that fit inside her handbag, and her phone, which showed 17% battery. Brooklyn that night was wet with rain, the kind of small, persistent rain that clung to skin and hair like mist, but was cold enough to make her shiver. Streetlights flickered across the wet sidewalk, orange light reflecting on the road like blurred streaks of paint. Elise pulled her suitcase to the corner and stood there, not knowing where to go. With no money, no home, and no one left to call. Her mother was dead. Her father was someone she had never known. Her friends had slowly disappeared over 3 years of marriage because Troy had not liked her seeing anyone but him. She stood there, rain sticking to her face, mixing with something warmer running from the corners of her eyes, and thought perhaps this was the bottom. Perhaps there was nowhere lower than this. Her phone vibrated. 12% battery. A message from an unknown number. I know who just took your home. 47 Franklin Street, basement level. The door is open. Signed PK. Elise looked at the message. Looked at the dark street. Looked at the suitcase wet with rain. Then she started walking. 47 Franklin Street looked no different from the other red brick buildings in Tribeca. From the outside, dark, silent, the front door closed tight. But when Elise circled around to the back by instinct and found the iron door leading down to the basement, she realized it had already been opened. Not wide, only left ajar just enough for one person to step inside, as if someone had known exactly that she would come and did not want her to wait. The concrete stairs leading down were narrow and steep, pale fluorescent light washing the walls. But when she pushed open the second door at the bottom of the stairs, what appeared before her made her stop. A restoration studio. Not the small corner she rented in Brooklyn with a crooked wooden table and a set of second-hand lamps, but a professional space so complete she had only ever seen its kind in books about major museums in Europe. Specialized lights with adjustable color temperature hung on sliding rails. High-grade solvents stood neatly on stainless steel shelves. Fixed magnifying lenses rose from weighted bases, and a professional easel could rotate and tilt at every angle. Everything she had ever dreamed of was in that room. Quiet, ready, waiting for someone with hands skilled enough to use it. And in the center of the room, on the main easel, the painting was there. The same painting she had seen hanging on the wall in Paxton's private room. But now, at close range under specialized light, she finally saw it clearly. A portrait of a woman, oil on canvas, late 18th century in style, perhaps English school or colonial American. The woman in the painting had black hair pinned high, dark brown eyes looking straight ahead. Not smiling, but not sad either. The kind of gaze belonging to someone who had accepted everything life had thrown at her and still refused to collapse. A long slash ran diagonally from her right shoulder down near her waist, sharp and clean as if someone had deliberately used a knife. The left corner of the painting was burned black, the paint layer peeling in thin patches, the canvas beneath darkened by heat. But the woman's face was almost untouched, as if fire and blade had tried to destroy her but could not reach the most important part. Elise stood before the painting for a long time, forgetting that she was wet with rain, forgetting the suitcase at the foot of the stairs, forgetting everything that had happened over the last 24 hours. Professional instinct pulled her into a state of focus. Nothing could break. She tilted her head, assessed the depth of the slash, calculated how much of the original paint layer remained, and began building the restoration order in her mind, from outside to inside, from the worst damage to the lightest. She heard footsteps behind her but did not turn. Paxton stepped into the studio looking different from every other time she had seen him. No vest, no chandelier light, no auction room. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and on his left forearm, Elise saw a tattoo for the first time. 2 Latin words written in black ink, the script slanted, simple, but placed where he would see it every day. Ex scenaribus. She knew what it meant. From ashes. Paxton stood beside her, looking at the painting, and stayed silent for a long time before speaking, his voice lower than usual, as if this room demanded another version of him. This painting belonged to my mother. She hung it in the living room all through my childhood. She was the only person who ever looked at me and believed I was worthy of being loved. He paused. She died when I was 16. After that, the painting was taken, passed through many hands, damaged, forgotten. It took me 17 years to find it again. He said nothing more. He did not explain how his mother died, did not say who had taken the painting, did not open any door he did not want her to walk through. But the way he looked at the painting, the way his fingers lifted slightly and then lowered again as if he wanted to touch it but feared damaging it further, told Elise more than any words could have. She stepped closer to the painting, raised her hand, and stopped her fingertips a few millimeters from the canvas surface, close enough to feel the texture of the paint without touching it, exactly the way a professional restorer does when first approaching a work. "I'll bring her back," she whispered. Paxton said nothing, but Elise noticed his jaw tighten slightly. So quickly she would have missed it if she had not been looking at the right moment, and she understood that her words had touched something this man had buried very deep. She began examining the painting more carefully, tilting the easel, shining light through the back of the canvas to assess the damage to the ground layer, and that was when she realized it. Behind the canvas, in the upper right corner where the fabric was still intact, something had been hidden. A small, old piece of paper, partly obscured by paint bleed, that had seeped through from the front. She could not read the content, only see faint handwritten ink beneath the stained layer. But she knew one thing for certain. Someone had deliberately hidden this paper inside the painting, and it had been there for a very long time, perhaps decades, waiting for hands careful enough to find it. She had not yet had time to tell Paxton about the discovery when the studio door opened. Sable stepped in, her face colder than usual, her eyes sweeping quickly across the room before stopping on Paxton. Troy Whitmore hired someone to follow her. He knows she's here. Paxton's expression did not change. He did not turn to look at Sable. He was still looking at the painting, or perhaps at Elise. She was not sure. And then he spoke in an even voice, neither rising nor falling, as if discussing the weather. Increase security. No one touches her inside this building. Elise looked at the damaged painting, looked at the paper hidden behind the canvas, looked at the man with the tattoo that meant, from ashes on his forearm standing in the middle of his underworld, and she began to understand that she was not only restoring a painting. She was stepping into a world where, once she entered, she could never return as the person she had been. 3 days after Elise began restoring the painting, Troy struck back. She did not know what he had spent those days doing, or where he had been, but the result appeared on her phone one morning while she was sitting in the basement studio, brush in hand, her eyes focused on the burned left corner of the painting, which she was treating with a mild solvent. The first email came from Mrs. Henderson, a private collector on the Upper East Side, who had hired Elise to restore 2 small landscape paintings over the past 3 months and still owed her the final payment. The message was short, polite to the point of coldness. Dear Miss Thornton, we have received troubling information regarding your connection to an organization with legal concerns. We have decided to terminate the contract and will find another restorer. We wish you all the best. Elise finished reading it, and before she could understand, the second email arrived. Mr. Pratt, the owner of a small gallery in Chelsea, the man who had once told her that her skill should have been in a major museum. The message was almost the same reason, the same icy politeness of someone who wanted to cut ties as quickly as possible. A third email, a fourth, a fifth, each one opened with the same pattern of words. Troubling information, connection to an organization with legal concerns, decision to terminate. By the 6th email, Elise understood. Someone had sent information about her to her entire client list, and there was only one person in the world who had access to that list, because she had once saved it on the shared laptop in the Brooklyn apartment. Troy. She opened the email Mrs. Henderson had forwarded at her request, wanting to know what the source of this troubling information was. An anonymous email, no sender name, with 2 photographs of Elise entering Cade and Albright Auction House. One taken from the street corner, one through the glass door, both cropped and edited to make her look as if she were sneaking around. Beneath the photos was one line. Your restorer is involved with a criminal organization. Protect your reputation. Elise set the phone down on the table, the brush still in her hand, and looked at the painting being restored in front of her. The woman in the portrait looked back at her with a resilience Elise wished she had at that moment. Her eyes were wet, but no tears fell, not because she was strong, but because she was empty. Troy had taken her home, taken her money, and now taken the last source of income she had left. She sat there, in the most beautiful restoration studio she had ever seen, with a Mafia boss's painting in front of her, and no money in the world that belonged to her. The studio door opened. Sable stepped in, not looking at Elise, but going straight to the side table in the corner, setting down a thin laptop and opening a file she had already prepared. I got access to Renata Voss's work email, Sable said, her voice even as a weather report, by Mr. Cade's order. Paxton stepped in a few seconds after Sable, wearing the black shirt he always wore when he came down to the studio, sleeves rolled up, the tattoo Ex Ceneribus clearly visible beneath the lights. He stood behind Sable, looked at the screen, and Elise saw his eyes grow colder with every line. Troy Whitmore didn't only borrow gambling debt, Sable said. He laundered money through the investment fund where he works. Renata Voss's email contains accounting files showing the plan to transfer money into 3 accounts in the Cayman Islands. Sable turned the screen toward Elise. All 3 accounts were opened using your identity. Miss Thornton, your social security number, your address, your forged signature. Elise looked at the screen. Her name sat on 3 bank accounts in the Cayman Islands that she had never known existed, holding money she had never touched, serving a purpose she had never agreed to. Her husband had not only betrayed her, not only borrowed money in her name, but had turned her into a financial criminal on paper without her knowing. On paper, she said, her voice so calm it surprised even her. I'm the one committing the crime. Paxton looked at her. On paper. Not in reality. We'll fix that. Then he turned to Sable, and for the first time, Elise heard something in his voice that was not calm, but anger compressed so tightly it was almost impossible to recognize unless one listened carefully. He used my organization's name to spread anonymous emails, Paxton said. He dragged the Cade name into his scandal without permission. He did not raise his voice, did not clench his fist, but the way he said the words without permission made the temperature in the room seem to drop by several degrees. Find everything. Accounts, gambling, hidden assets. Everywhere he set foot in the past 6 months. I want Troy Whitmore to have nowhere left to hide. Sable nodded and left the room, quick and precise, exactly as she had entered. Elise remained seated in the studio, among the paintings and solvents, looking at Paxton as he stood with his back to her, looking at the portrait of the woman it had taken him 17 years to find again. You knew about the 3 accounts from the beginning? She asked. Paxton did not turn around. I knew he was using your name. Then why didn't you tell me from the start? Silence. Then Paxton turned his head, only enough for her to see half his face beneath the light. The faint scar along his left jaw. His dark brown eyes offering no apology but not looking away either. Because I needed you to see it for yourself, he said. So you'd never go back to him. In the days that followed, Elise didn't count. She measured time by layers of paint. The first layer peeled away was the day she stopped checking her phone to see whether Troy had called back. The second layer was the day she stopped thinking about the Brooklyn apartment. The third layer was the day she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had laughed without forcing herself to. She worked from early morning, when the fluorescent lights in the basement studio were the only source of light, until late at night, when the sounds of the city above slowly faded and only the soft hum of the dehumidifier remained in the corner of the room. With every cut she repaired on the painting, she felt something inside herself being mended too. It wasn't some pretty metaphor she had invented to comfort herself. It was a real feeling, resting in her fingertips as she placed each new strand of canvas into the torn fabric, as she mixed paint to match the original tone from 200 years ago, as she watched the woman's face in the portrait slowly become clearer day by day, as though the woman were gradually opening her eyes after a long, forced sleep. The painting had been damaged, but it hadn't been destroyed, and Elise, sitting before it every night with solvent-stained hands and an aching back from bending too long, began to believe that perhaps she hadn't been destroyed either. At night, Paxton came down to the studio, not every night, but often enough for Elise to realize he had a habit of coming there after everything upstairs was finished, after the auction house had closed and the people who worked for him had gone home. He didn't say much. Sometimes he only sat in the old leather chair in the corner of the studio, reading a book whose title Elise could never quite see. A glass of whiskey set on the side table but rarely emptied. His presence was quiet in a way Elise had never been used to, because Troy had always filled every space with opinions, with demands, with sentences that sounded like concern, but were really control. Paxton asked nothing of her. He didn't ask how far she had gotten. He didn't judge her pace. He didn't comment on her technique. He was simply there. And strangely, that presence made Elise feel safer than any promise ever had. One night, while Elise was mixing solvent at the side table near the studio door, she heard Sable talking on the phone outside in the hallway. The door wasn't fully closed, and Sable's voice carried in clearly enough for Elise to catch a few words. Not the whole conversation, only sharp fragments. He has until the weekend to handle it, Sable said, her voice low and steady, but carrying the weight of a warning that didn't need to be repeated. If not, we'll handle it for him, and he won't like our way. Silence. Then Sable added, Mr. Cade doesn't ask twice. The call ended. Sable's footsteps faded away. Elise stood beside the solvent table, holding the bottle of liquid she had forgotten she was holding, and realized with absolute, undeniable clarity that this restoration studio, with its warm lights and professional magnifying glass and perfect easel, sat inside the heart of a world that wasn't gentle at all. When Paxton walked into the studio a few minutes later, the familiar book in his hand, Elise didn't turn to look at him right away. She waited for him to sit in the leather chair in the corner, waited for the sound of the book opening, and only then did she speak, her voice soft but without hesitation. "Have you ever hurt other people?" The sound of the book stopped. The silence stretched long enough for Elise to hear the dehumidifier in the corner of the room, her own heartbeat, and the low murmur of the city above. Then Paxton answered, his voice low, not avoiding, not defending himself. "I've done things that make me unworthy of sitting beside you." Elise turned to look at him. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were still fixed on the closed book resting on his lap, though he wasn't reading anything at all. He was staring into some distant place she couldn't follow him to. She waited for fear to come, but it didn't. Instead, she felt something stranger. Respect, because for the first time in her life, a man sat in front of her and told the truth, instead of saying something beautiful. Troy spoke beautifully. Troy said everything she wanted to hear until she discovered that not a single word of it was true. Paxton had said one ugly, bare, unforgivable sentence, but at least it was true. And after 3 years of living inside lies, the truth, even when it hurt, was worth more than 1,000 sweet words. Paxton stood, walked to the painting that was gradually healing, the woman's face now almost whole, her resilient eyes looking out from the new paint Elise had carefully matched. He stood there for a long time in silence, then said, his voice slightly rough, as though the sentence had to pass through some very deep place before it could reach his mouth. "You did what I thought no one could do." Elise looked at him, then at the painting, and didn't know whether he was talking about the portrait or about himself. She didn't ask. Some sentences didn't need an answer. That night, after Paxton had left the studio and Elise remained alone with the painting under the late-night lamp, she continued peeling away the stained layer of paint behind the canvas, where the old piece of paper had been hidden for so many years. Dry flakes of paint loosened under the gentle solvent, and the handwritten ink beneath slowly became clearer, letter by letter, stroke by stroke, like a voice that had been silenced for too long, trying to speak one last time. Elise couldn't read all of it yet, but she recognized one word on the first line, and that word made her hand stop in midair. Child. Elise needed more titanium white pigment and a bottle of specialized solvent that the studio had run out of the day before. So that afternoon she left the basement and stepped up onto the Tribeca Street for the first time after nearly a week, without going outside. The afternoon sunlight made her narrow her eyes. She had grown so used to the artificial lights in the studio that she had forgotten the sky could still be bright, and it took her a few seconds for her eyes to adjust before she realized the black sedan parked across the street wasn't an ordinary car. Troy stepped out from the back seat. He was wearing a suit, the kind of suit he only wore when he wanted to impress someone more important than Elise, and walking beside him was a middle-aged man carrying a leather briefcase, whom she guessed was a lawyer. Then the door on the other side of the car opened, and Renata Voss stepped out, her auburn red hair stirring lightly in the afternoon wind, her lipstick dark, a trench coat draped over her shoulders, the exact coat Elise recognized from a catalog she could never afford to buy from. The three of them walked straight toward her as though they had known exactly what time she would come outside, and Elise understood that Troy still had people watching her even though she had lost her home, lost her money, and lost almost everything else. Troy stopped 2 steps away from her, no closer, as if he were keeping a safe distance for himself. Not for her. The lawyer opened the leather briefcase, pulled out a stack of papers, handed it to Troy, and Troy placed it in Elise's hands without asking whether she wanted to hold it. "Sign it," he said. "Give up your right to file any property claims and agree not to report anything. You sign, everything ends. You go your way, I go mine." Elise looked down at the papers, her eyes moving over the dense legal lines, and she understood at once that if she signed, she would give up the right to recover every sum of money Troy had taken, every asset Troy had mortgaged under her name, and every piece of fraud evidence she held would become worthless in court. "If you don't sign," Troy added, his voice dropping lower, though every word had been calculated, "I'll report you for helping launder money. 3 Cayman accounts are in your name, your signature. On paper, you're the criminal, not me." Elise looked at him. She looked at the man she had once shared a bed with, shared meals with, shared rainy Brooklyn nights with, when she had thought life was hard. But at least she wasn't alone. He was standing here, on a Tribeca sidewalk, in broad daylight, threatening to turn her into a criminal with his own crime. She looked down at her hands, still marked with faint traces of linseed oil beneath her nails from that morning's restoration work. And she spoke, her voice calm, not loud, not trembling, each word as clear as if she were reading from a sentence she had already written in her mind through many sleepless nights. You used my name, my money, my life, to cover up your crime, and now you want me to sign so you can get away? She folded the papers closed and placed them back into Troy's hands. No. Troy stepped so close to her face that she could smell the cologne he always sprayed too heavily, his voice hissing through his teeth. You don't understand who you're playing with, Elise. But the sentence hadn't even died away before Troy froze. His eyes moved past Elise's shoulder, toward the space behind her, and every trace of aggression on his face went out like a light cut from power. Elise didn't need to turn around to know who was standing behind her. She heard a car door open and close, heard the slow footsteps on the sidewalk, heavy but unhurried, the steps of a man who never needed to hurry because no one dared make him wait. Paxton stopped beside Elise, not standing in front of her like a shield, but standing beside her, level with her. He didn't speak. He didn't look at Elise. He only looked at Troy with the gaze Elise had first seen in the auction room. Assessing, cold, promising nothing, and needing to promise nothing, because everyone knew Paxton Cade's promises didn't have to be spoken aloud. The faint scar along the left side of his jaw glimmered under the harsh afternoon sun. Troy stepped back 1 step. The lawyer stepped back 2 steps. Renata stayed still, but the smile on her lips faded noticeably. Let's go, Troy, Renata said, her voice still holding its calm surface, though her eyes never left Paxton. Then she looked at Elise, tilted her head, and said in a voice so sweet it tasted sour, You think the Mafia boss will protect you forever? The 3 of them turned and walked back toward the sedan. Troy didn't look back. Renata looked back once, the poisonous smile still clinging to her mouth like lipstick that was hard to wipe away. When the sedan drove off, Elise stood on the sidewalk, still holding the list of materials she had forgotten was in her hand. She turned to look at Paxton, about to say thank you, but he had already turned away and was walking back toward the car parked nearby. Before opening the car door, he spoke over his shoulder, his voice even, brief, and not the slightest bit warmer than usual. You should call a lawyer. Sable will make the introduction. Then he got into the car, the door closed, the car rolled away, and Elise remained alone on the Tribeca sidewalk, with linseed oil still staining her hands, and Renata's words still echoing in her mind, burning like smoke. That night, Elise worked alone in the studio, the specialized light shining at an angle across the back of the canvas, where the piece of paper had almost completely emerged after many days of her patiently peeling away each stained layer of paint with gentle solvent and a hand lighter than breath. The word child, that she had read the night before, had now drawn other words after it. The handwritten ink faint, but still clear enough on the paper yellowed by time. She used specialized tweezers to remove the paper from the old glue that had held it to the back of the canvas, so gently that she held her breath through the entire process, afraid that even her breathing might tear the thing someone had tried to hide here decades ago. When the paper rested neatly in her palm, Elise read. The handwriting slanted, written in ink, trembling slightly in a few places as though the writer had been weak or crying, perhaps both. There was no date, no name of the person meant to receive it, only a single word at the beginning. Child. When you read these lines, I won't be here anymore. I hid this letter inside the painting because I know you'll find a way to take it back. You always take back what belongs to you. That's the thing that makes me both proud and afraid. Don't become the man you think you have to become. Become the man I know you can be. There was nothing more. No farewell, no signature. Only that much, as though that woman had poured everything she had left into those 2 sentences, and trusted that her son would understand. Elise sat still for a very long time, the paper in her hand, and thought of her own mother, of the words spoken on a sickbed, of the way mothers who were about to leave always tried to tuck their love into any place they believed their children would find it. A painting, a sentence, a memory. She didn't cry. She had already cried enough for her own mother, but she cried for the woman in this letter, the mother who had loved her son so deeply that she hid her final message in the safest place she could think of, and for the 16-year-old boy who had lost his mother, then lost the painting, then needed 17 years to find them both again. The next morning, when Paxton came down to the studio, Elise didn't speak right away. She waited for him to sit in the familiar leather chair, waited for him to open his book. Then she stood, walked over, and placed the piece of paper on the open page. Paxton looked down. The hand holding the edge of the page stopped, then slowly picked up the paper. He read. Elise didn't know how many times he read it because he stood still for a very long time, his eyes never leaving the words, his jaw clenched so tightly that she could see the muscle rising beneath his skin. There were no tears, no sigh, only a silence so heavy that she felt it pressing against her chest, even though the letter wasn't from her mother. Then Paxton folded the paper, carefully, slowly, along the old crease, as though respecting the way his mother had folded it for the last time, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his heart. He turned away and walked out of the studio without saying a word. Elise didn't follow him. She stood in the middle of the studio, watching the door close, and understood that some wounds had to heal in silence, by the person who carried them, by time, by anything except the comfort of an outsider. That night, Elise's phone rang. An unknown number, but the woman's voice on the other end was calm and professional. The lawyer Sable had introduced. Miss Thornton, the file is ready. The evidence of identity forgery, signature forgery, and financial fraud has all been compiled. You can file the report at any time. Elise looked at the nearly finished painting in front of her, the resilient woman's face now almost whole, her eyes looking straight at Elise as though saying, "It's time." Elise didn't tell Paxton. She didn't tell Sable. That morning, she sat on the small bed in the break room Sable had prepared for her on the upper floor of the auction house, using her phone in absolute secrecy, and searched on her own. She looked for investigative journalists, not on the major news sites, but on smaller pages devoted to financial fraud. Reporters who had written about fraudulent investment funds and corporate money laundering, people she believed would understand her story not because it was sensational, but because it was true. She found a name. A female reporter who had exposed an embezzlement case at a public pension fund 3 years earlier, and she sent an email. It wasn't long, it wasn't self-pitying, it only summarized the truth. Her husband had forged her identity to borrow gambling debt money, opened offshore accounts, laundered money through the investment fund where he worked, and she had evidence. She sent the email at 7:15 in the morning. At 9 o'clock, the reporter replied. At 10 o'clock, she called the lawyer Sable had introduced, and filed an official report as a victim of identity theft. She did all of this alone, in the small room, with a cold cup of coffee on the table and the red brick wall in front of her, without needing anyone to stand behind her, without needing anyone to nod and give permission. This was her fight, and she chose her own way to fight it. Troy found out 2 days later. She didn't know who had told him. Perhaps his lawyer had received notice from the investigators. Perhaps Renata had heard from some source inside the investment fund. But the result was that Troy panicked, and people who panic make mistakes. Troy hired someone to breach Cade and Albright's isolated mainframe server to destroy the digital backups, which could only be accessed directly from inside the building. He didn't know 2 things. First, the original evidence wasn't in the studio. It had already been backed up by Elise's lawyer and submitted to the authorities. Second, Sable Munoz had spread word through the underworld days earlier. Anyone who accepted work from Troy Whitmore would have to face Paxton Cade, and no one in that world wanted to face Paxton Cade. As a result, not a single hired hand dared take the job. Troy contacted 4 men, and all 4 refused without needing to explain. The 5th accepted, and that was exactly the man Sable wanted him to find, because the 5th man worked for Paxton. The intruder entered the auction house at 2 o'clock in the morning through the back door, moved through the dark hallway along the exact route Sable had laid out, and was caught by security the moment he stepped through the back door. Swiftly, silently, without resistance, Sable called Paxton at 2:20 in the morning. Caught him. He confessed that Troy Whitmore hired him, and there are clear instruction messages on his phone. Silence, on the other end of the line. Then Sable continued, her voice carrying something almost like cold satisfaction. He put his own head in the noose. Paxton nodded, though Sable couldn't see him. But she knew he had nodded because she had worked with him long enough to read even his silence. He said nothing more for a few seconds. Then Sable asked the question she had known she would have to ask from the beginning. The question everything in their world eventually led back to. Which way? Paxton didn't answer right away. Sable heard his breathing through the phone, even and slow. The breathing of a man standing between 2 roads, and knowing that this time, his choice wouldn't only decide Troy Whitmore's fate, but also decide who he would be when he looked in the mirror tomorrow. Paxton answered Sable at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. After almost 40 minutes of silence, that Sable didn't break because she knew this wasn't the kind of decision anyone could rush. "Hand him over to the police," he said. Sable wasn't surprised, but she didn't agree right away either. She stood in the upstairs hallway of the auction house, the phone pressed to her ear, looking out the window where Manhattan was still blazing with light even though the world around them was sinking into darkness, and asked the question she had to ask, not because she wanted to, but because it was her job. "You know the FBI will ask how our organization is connected to this gambling debt, don't you? Troy borrowed money from us. Illegal betting, through our system. When they pull the thread, that thread will lead right back here. Silence. Not the silence of a man who hadn't thought of it, but the silence of a man who had thought it through carefully, knew the price, and still chose to pay it." "I know," Paxton said. "Then why?" Sable asked. And for the first time in 12 years of working with Paxton Cade, there was something in her voice that wasn't anger or worry, but confusion, real confusion. Paxton didn't answer right away. Sable heard his footsteps moving slowly through the room on the other end of the line. Perhaps he was looking out the window. Perhaps he was looking at the small folded letter he had kept in the inside pocket of his jacket since the day Elise gave it to him. She wasn't sure, but when he spoke, his voice was different. Not colder, not warmer, slower, as though every word had to pass through some very deep place before it was allowed out. "Because for the first time, I want to do what's right, even if it's only once." Sable was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Understood." And she began making arrangements. The evidence was handed over through Elise's lawyer, the one who had filed the report against Troy on behalf of Elise as a victim of identity theft. The financial fraud records, the forged signatures, the Cayman accounts, the gambling history, the emails between Troy and Renata. All of it was compiled and sent to federal investigators through official legal channels. Paxton Cade's name didn't appear on any document. No legal fingerprints, no direct connection. But Paxton knew, and Sable knew, that the thread would lead back eventually. Not today, perhaps not this month, but it would come, and when it did, he would have to answer questions no lawyer could answer for him. He accepted it. That was the price. Troy Whitmore was arrested at a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city at 6 o'clock the next morning. Elise wasn't there. She didn't need to be there, but her lawyer told her about it afterward in a calm voice, like someone who had witnessed that scene many times before. The agents arrived, knocked on the door, and Troy opened it, his face showing no surprise. He stood in the motel doorway wearing a wrinkled shirt, barefoot, his hair disheveled. And when the agents read him his rights, he only looked down at the floor, his face empty, like a man who had known this day would come for a long time, but had kept living as if it didn't exist. He didn't resist. He didn't shout. He didn't call Elise's name. He followed the agents out to the car, and the door of the house closed behind him, like the closing of a chapter no one ever wanted to read again. Elise heard the news from her lawyer over the phone while sitting in the swivel chair in the basement studio, the nearly finished painting in front of her beneath the specialized light. The woman's face in the portrait was now almost whole, her resilient eyes looking straight ahead, the cuts repaired, the burned corner restored so carefully it was almost impossible to see. She set the phone down on the table. She wasn't happy. She wasn't triumphant. She didn't feel justice, or victory, or any of the things people usually feel when the person who betrayed them finally pays the price. She only felt tired, and light, and sad in the way only someone who had truly loved and truly been betrayed could understand. She picked up the brush, dipped it into solvent, and continued touching it to the painting. Because that was what she knew how to do. Because the painting still needed her, even when no one else did. Sable told Elise the next afternoon, not because Elise needed to know, but because Sable believed she deserved to know. Renata Voss had made her move before Troy was arrested, not a few hours before, but coincidentally during his panic. During the exact hours of Troy's frantic panic and failed operation to breach Cade and Albright auction house, she had been sitting in her luxury high-rise apartment with her laptop open in front of her, transferring all the money from the 3 Cayman accounts, the accounts opened in Elise's name but controlled by Troy and Renata, into another account known only to her. Then she closed the laptop, finished her coffee, stood up, and disappeared. No goodbye message for Troy. No final call. Not a single trace except 3 empty accounts and an old phone left behind in an airport trash can. Sable told it in an even voice, sitting in the side chair in the studio, her legs crossed, her face expressionless as though she were reading a weather report. She flew somewhere, maybe Europe, maybe not. It doesn't matter. The money went with her. Elise sat before the painting, brush in hand, listening to every detail and feeling something strange. It wasn't satisfaction because Renata had betrayed Troy. Not the poetic justice people often looked for in stories about the wicked meeting their punishment. She only felt tired. Tired because everything circled back to money and greed, and people using other people as tools, then throwing them away once they were no longer useful. Troy had used her, then Renata had used Troy. And in the end, none of them had anything real, because you can't keep what you steal, and you can't love someone you deceive. Where did she go? Elise asked, not because she cared, but because she needed to say something to fill the heavy silence inside her. Sable shrugged. It doesn't matter. She's no longer connected to you. Then Sable stood, smoothed down her suit jacket, and added before leaving the room, Troy Whitmore lost his freedom, lost his money, and lost the woman he left you for. He betrayed you, and he was betrayed in return by the very person he chose instead of you. Sometimes life balances itself in its own way. The studio door closed. Elise sat alone with the painting. The woman's face in the portrait had now come back to life almost completely. The new paint Elise had carefully matched from the original palette, blending with the paint that was 200 years old, the cuts disappearing beneath the new canvas, the burned corner restored so well that only someone who knew how to look would realize there had ever been fire there. Elise looked at the painting and saw herself, not because she resembled the woman in the portrait, but because she understood what it felt like to be cut, burned, passed through too many hands, and then finally meet a hand patient enough to put every piece back where it belonged. Only that hand was her own. She set the brush down, straightened her back, and reached for the glass of water on the side table when her phone vibrated. Not Sable, not the lawyer, not some frightening unknown number. Mrs. Henderson, the woman from the Upper East Side, the private collector, the only person on Elise's entire client list who hadn't canceled her contract after receiving Troy's smear email. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had once said to Elise after getting back 2 restored landscapes, "You have hands that understand the pain of paint." Elise answered. Mrs. Henderson's voice was warm but direct, exactly her way. "Elise, I have someone I'd like to introduce you to. The Metropolitan Museum is looking for a restorer for its 17th century portrait collection. I showed them photographs of the 2 paintings you did for me." Silence. Then Mrs. Henderson added, her voice softer. "You deserve more than what you think of yourself, Elise." Elise set the phone down, looked at the painting in front of her, looked at her own hands, still marked with linseed oil, and for the first time in a very long time, she believed it. The final drop of paint was pale yellow, mixed from 3 pigments that had taken Elise almost an hour to match to the original tone from 200 years ago, the kind of warm yellow like candlelight that 18th century painters used to create light in a subject's eyes. The smallest highlight, yet the most important one, because it was what made a painting live or die. She dipped the tip of the thinnest brush into the color, held her breath, and placed a single stroke on the left pupil of the woman in the portrait. The gaze came back to life, not in the dramatic way people might imagine, with no burst of light and no magical moment. It was only that the eyes, which had looked flat and clouded before, suddenly had depth, direction, presence. The woman in the painting looked straight at Elise, and Elise looked back, and between 2 women separated by 2 centuries, there was an understanding no language needed to describe. She stepped back 3 paces, set the brush down, and looked at the whole work for the first time since she had begun. The painting was beautiful. Not beautiful in the way it had originally been, because the original had been lost long ago beneath cuts and fire and time, but beautiful in the way of something that had passed through damage and returned. The tear had been mended, but under angled light, if someone looked closely, a faint trace remained, like a healed scar that hadn't disappeared, and Elise had deliberately kept that mark because she believed that erasing every wound from a painting was the same as erasing every memory from a person. Dishonest and unnecessary. She breathed out, long and slow, and felt something light open in her chest. as if the cord that had been pulled tight for weeks had finally been cut. Paxton came down to the studio that evening. He stopped at the door when he saw the painting, and Elise realized this was the first time she had ever seen him stop because something had made him unready. He walked forward slowly, stood before the painting, and said nothing. The silence lasted longer than any silence Elise had ever witnessed from him, longer than when he had read his mother's letter, longer than those nights when he sat in the corner of the studio with the book, whose pages he didn't turn. His eyes rested on the woman's face in the portrait, and Elise saw something in his gaze that she knew he would never admit aloud. Not tears, not open pain, but recognition. The recognition that the memory of his mother he had carried in his mind for 17 years was now looking back at him from the painting, more real than any dream. "She looks exactly as I remember," he said, his voice slightly rough. Elise didn't answer. Some sentences didn't need a reply. Paxton turned to her. "The $400,000 debt is cleared. Troy's fraud file has been handed to your lawyer. The agreement is complete." Brief. Clean, like every transaction in his world. No extra sentence, no extra emotion. But he didn't ask her to stay. He didn't ask whether she wanted to keep working for him. He didn't open any door he knew would lead her into an unsafe place. "Where will you go?" he asked. "The Metropolitan Museum called," Elise said. "They need someone to restore their 17th century portrait collection." Paxton nodded slowly. "You deserve it." 2 words, no more. But the way he said them, slowly, clearly, as though weighing each word on his tongue before letting it go, made Elise feel that those 2 words carried more weight than any praise she had ever received in her life. Silence settled between them. No embrace. No promises. No sentence beginning with if, or when, or maybe someday. Only 2 people standing before a painting that had just been brought back to life, each of them knowing the road ahead divided in 2 different directions, and neither of them would say it aloud because saying it would make it real in a way that hurt more. Elise lowered her head slightly, not as a bow, but as an acknowledgement. Acknowledging that this man, with all his darkness and scars and sins, had given her something her husband never had. Respect. She turned and walked toward the studio door, then stopped at the threshold. She looked back at Paxton one last time. He had already turned away from her, standing before the painting, and one of his hands was touching the surface of the canvas, gently, his fingertips moving over the face of the woman he had spent 17 years trying to find again, with a tenderness almost unnatural for a man like him, for a hand that had done too many things that weren't gentle. Elise turned away and stepped outside. Before leaving the studio, Elise did one final thing. She stood in the middle of the room where she had spent so many sleepless nights with solvent and brushes and specialized light, looking down at her left hand, where the wedding ring had remained on her ring finger all this time. She didn't know why she had kept wearing it, maybe out of habit, maybe because she had forgotten, maybe because some part of her still hadn't been ready to admit that the marriage had died long before the divorce papers were ever signed. The ring was cheap, which Troy had bought in a hurry at a pawn shop in downtown Brooklyn 3 years ago. Troy had said he would replace it with a nicer one once he was stable, but that stability never came because money always went into gambling faster than it ever went into a savings account. Elise twisted the ring, pulled it gently over her knuckle, and took it off. It was lighter than she had imagined, or perhaps she was stronger than she remembered. She placed the ring on the side table beside the painting, right next to the solvent jar and the magnifying glass, gently, not throwing it, not hurling it, not tossing it into the trash or out a window, or doing any of the dramatic things people often did in stories about liberation. She simply set it down, as though setting down a burden she had carried for too long, and felt her finger become weightless, empty in a way that meant freedom, not loss. She took her old handbag, the suitcase she had dragged from Brooklyn on that rainy night, now tucked in the corner of the upstairs break room, and walked up the stairs. She didn't look back at the studio. She didn't look back at the painting. She had given it everything she had, and now it belonged to the person who needed it, just as she now belonged to herself. Outside, Tribeca was waking up, but Elise didn't walk toward Tribeca. She took the train back to Brooklyn, back toward the city where she had begun, not to return, but because she wanted to move forward from the place where she had fallen. Brooklyn morning welcomed her with the most familiar things: the sound of a garbage truck backing into a narrow alley, the metal gate of a grocery store rolling up with its familiar screech, the smell of coffee from the small shop on the corner where the Italian owner always roasted beans at 6 o'clock in the morning. She walked along the sidewalk, her suitcase rolling behind her, neither hurried nor slow, with the steady steps of someone who knew where she was going, even if she didn't yet know exactly where the road would lead. She stopped at the intersection and waited for the light to turn green, and while she waited, she rolled up the sleeve of her shirt with the instinct of someone used to working with bare hands, and the morning light fell across her left wrist, where there was a small line of writing she had tattooed herself the night before, with the hand-poke tattoo kit a previous assistant had left in the studio drawer. 2 Latin words, the strokes uneven, trembling slightly at the first letter because Elise had done it herself with her non-dominant hand, but clear, readable, permanent. It was her own private sanctuary, a quiet vow that not even Paxton knew about. While she had first seen it on his forearm, she now carried it for herself, taken from the painting, from the resilient woman who had been cut and burned, yet still looked straight ahead, from the letter of the mother who had hidden her love in the safest place she could imagine. From every night Elise had sat in the basement studio and mended each wound in the canvas, until the wound inside her began to heal too. The light turned green. Elise stepped into the street, smiling, softly, truly, for the first time in a very long time. A smile meant for no one but herself, then walked into the stream of people moving toward a new day that she, for the first time, truly wanted to live. And Elise's story stops here. But perhaps what she leaves behind for us doesn't stop. Because somewhere in her journey, in those nights when she sat alone mending someone else's painting in order to heal herself, there is a quiet but profound lesson I want to share with you. Your worth isn't measured by the person standing beside you, not by the one who chooses to stay, and not by the one who chooses to leave. Your worth lies in the way you rise when there's no one left, in the way you gather every broken piece in the dark without needing an audience, without needing applause, needing only your own hands and the belief that you deserve to heal. In life, there will be people who take advantage of your trust. There will be people who steal the work of your hands. There will be people who make you believe you're smaller than you truly are. But please remember this. No one can take away who you really are unless you allow them to. And sometimes, the strongest thing isn't fighting back. It isn't shouting. It isn't proving yourself to the whole world. Sometimes the strongest thing is simply walking away. Quietly, calmly, with your shoulders straight, and a heart that knows you deserve more than what you've endured. If this story touched you in any way, I truly want to hear from you. Leave a comment and share the feelings that come from deep within your heart, because every story you carry deserves to be heard. If you found this story meaningful, please press like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so that every day there will be more stories that touch the heart. I wish you and the people you love good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Thank you for being here until the very last moment. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.